The Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by Heather McDonald. Heather is one of the smartest political commentators and writers out there. She is an attorney, bestselling author of several books, including The Diversity Delusion, and a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So Heather, thank you so much for coming on. It's a real pleasure to finally meet you.
Pleasure on my part as well, Ashton. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So I wanted to start off here. You've written a good deal about the woke, intersectional, ideological dogmas, which have sort of penetrated so much of our society. The diversity, equity, inclusion crowd, would say that they're just trying to level the playing field. We're just trying to get more diversity, and we need to do this for an indefinite period of time because America is systemically racist. And once we can subjectively conclude that diversity has been achieved, if ever, then we can maybe talk about more race-neutral things. What's the problem with that argument?
Well, the problem is that it involves massive racial preferences in every institution that is declaring itself fanatically committed to diversity. And the fact is, because of the large academic skills gap, Ashton, you can have diversity or you can have meritocracy. You cannot have both. The reason that we don't have proportional racial representation in mainstream institutions is not racism. There is not a single mainstream institution which is not just turning itself into knots, trying to hire and promote as many so-called underrepresented minorities as possible. Underrepresented minorities is the academic term. The acronym is URMs for Blacks and Hispanics. Asians don't count because they are academically competitive. In fact, they're superior. So they get written out of being sources of diversity and minorities on college campuses. But it is the academic skills gap that prevents Google from being, say, 13% Black, which is the Black proportion of the US population. When you look at grade school, high school math attainment, you have for 12th graders about 54% of Black 12th graders don't even possess basic mastery of 12th grade math skills. They are below basic, meaning they don't even have partial mastery of those skills. And that skills gap never closes. So you have every year at most in the STEM fields, at most 1% of all PhDs in various engineering fields or physics fields going to Black candidates. Will leave aside for the moment whether those candidates have been passed along on the basis of preferences. In many STEM fields, there are no Black candidates. So for Google to implicitly accuse its own managers of racism because it doesn't have 13% Black engineers or computer scientists is completely anti-scientific because they are not in the pipeline. And so there are two problems here, Ashton. In order to engineer diversity, you have to radically lower standards. And we see that in every university that is minimally selective across the country. Blacks and Hispanics are being admitted under a set of academic expectations that would be automatically, if they're automatically disqualifying if presented by whites and Asians. Blacks can get in with very low SATs. Again, if a white or Asian would present those, they wouldn't even be looked at. So you are lowering our standards. But the other problem is, and this is really my big gripe with racial preferences, it's less what conservatives usually rail about, which is that, it's unfair or unconstitutional, and we have an equal protection jurisprudence that's been built up to try and get around those questions. I find that jurisprudence impossibly, annoyingly in bad faith and full of all sorts of fictions. The real problem is that these massive racial preferences do not help their alleged beneficiaries. Let's take it out of the highly charged issue of race and think of it in terms of sex. If MIT, already very left-wing, decides it wants to up its female quotient in its freshman class even further than it already has, and it admits me, and let's say I have an SAT of 650 on my math SATs, it admits me to a class where the average SAT is 800. What's going to happen? I am going to flounder. I'm going to struggle in my classes because teaching will be geared towards the norm. The norm being people who aced advanced calculus in high school, who are firmly in control, and I will fall behind. That is not doing me any favors. I would have been much better off had I been admitted to a college. Nobody's saying that I shouldn't go to college with math SATs of 650, but had I gone to Boston College or Boston University, where I was matched with my academic peers, I would have a much better chance of graduating with an engineering degree or a physics degree than I would graduating from MIT. And we see that with Black beneficiaries. They disproportionately drop out of STEM fields because they've been catapulted. The one group, it's a cruel thing to do. It's heartless on the part of these grandstanding university administrations who want to feel like they're exercising noblesse oblige. They're setting up these Black students on average to fail just so they can look upon their domain and feel so proud of themselves for diversity. It's a cruel thing to do. It's also academically counterproductive for these students themselves.
You bring up a really good point there. It's gone even a little bit more pernicious than that, because you see this, and I actually pulled up the stats with MCAT scores. And this is where you get into like actual situations where, there's life or death consequences. So if you have an MCAT score of 2426, which is below average, and a below average GPA, and you're Black, you have a 56% chance of getting into medical school. If you're white, it's 8%. If you're Asian, it's 6%. Do we want mediocre physicians presiding over life and death scenarios? And on top of that, wouldn't that in itself lead to some sort of stigmatizing of certain groups? So let's say you had a couple not great physicians of a certain race, and that might make people more prejudiced and stereotypical.
Well, there is an enormous effort underway to punish anybody who acknowledges these facts or acknowledges the fact that a racial preference regime does impose stigma on its alleged beneficiaries. You're not allowed to say it. And so we have students being forced to live a lie. High school seniors, they all know each other's SAT scores. They can see what's going on, and they see that their Black peers are getting admitted to schools with much lower SATs than they are, schools from which they may be rejected. And yet, if any student mentions the existence of these preferences, he's castigated as a racist. On the one hand, these universities are completely illogical. They say on the one hand to the Supreme Court, if you deny us the ability to exercise these vast racial preferences, to lower our standards in an extraordinarily consequential way, we will not be able to achieve this alleged end of diversity. And then at the same time, they'll say, oh, if you suggest that we have lowered standards to get Black students in, you're a racist.
Right.
So they both claim this is essential and deny that it's going on. As far as the real life consequences, of course you're right. In normalizing these preferences, the elites in our societies are engaged in a profoundly nihilistic enterprise, which is to deny that we can make judgments about different levels of academic skill, competence, and knowledge. And we're pretending that everything is equal and that there are not some people who are better at certain things than other people are. And so you have this movement now to ban the submission of SATs as undergraduates. More and more medical schools are saying we don't want MCATs for Black students. Graduate schools in STEM are saying GREs are no longer required. We don't really want to see them. And I posit that the reason for that movement, it is an illogical movement, because the reality today is that schools do in fact pay enormous attention to these objective, colorblind, valid, standardized tests of academic competence. They simply race norm them. So they have one scale for admitting whites and Asians, and they calculate the ranks of their applicants out to the like 0.00001% of precision. And then they have a completely different scale that's race norm, that's lower for Blacks and Hispanics, and they rank people within that. So they could continue accepting these scores and continue doing their race norming. The reason that they are saying they want to ban the submission of scores entirely so that nobody will be taking the MCATs, nobody will be taking the GMATs, nobody will be taking the GREs or the SATs, is to put the College Board and the medical board that administers the MCATs out of existence entirely. Because right now, those objective tests provide us with the last remaining evidence of how vast the skills gap is. And we need that knowledge, we need those facts to fight back against the phony narrative that is the narrative that dominates mainstream institutions today, which is that the only reason why Blacks and Hispanics are not proportionally represented in mainstream and elite institutions is racism.
Yeah.
We need those data points to fight back and say, no, here's the reason. It's the academic skills gap.
It bothers me the most, not to harp on this, but it really is the most important bit, because with medical schools, they're actually capped. Like the number of seats are capped in all the medical schools in this country. And so if you're denying the people who are qualified because of their race, such as the Asians, and you're putting in their place somebody who has much lower scores, it's almost like a double assault on the practice, because you're going to be pushing up people who are not qualified, and you're going to be prohibiting people who are qualified from entering the field.
Ashton, I mean, that's absolutely right. And the only response that the proponents of racial preferences can have, and these proponents are everywhere, they are everywhere in the corporate world, in the law world, the banking world, academic world. The only response they can have is that those tests don't matter, which, as I say, is a nihilist position. They obviously do matter. Right. And it's not just medical school where it's zero sum, it's zero sum everywhere. And this is where I find the whole jurisprudence of equal protection, which is how we currently evaluate racial preferences and admissions, so grotesquely in bad faith, because the judges will say, oh, this isn't a zero sum proposition. It's always zero sum. All seats at schools are limited. You admit one person and you don't admit somebody else. In medical schools, as you say, this can be a life or death matter. We are for sure going to be slowing down scientific progress, because I cannot tell you, it's not just an MCAT admissions issue. The entire medical profession, whether it's the federal funding agencies, the licensing boards, the American Association of Medical Colleges, the AMA, have all turned themselves into slavish imitations of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo in their daily railing against science as a racist enterprise, medicine as a racist enterprise, Lancet, JAMA, all of what used to be the groundbreaking essential magazines of scientific medical research have all declared that science is racist, that medicine is racist. And what's happened, you know, another fictions that one comes across in the justification for racial preferences is, okay, it's merely a thumb on the scale. No, the preferences are massive, as you say. To go back to those MCAT data that you earlier referenced, it means that a Black student with mediocre MCATs and GPAs has a 9 times higher chance of admission than an Asian, and a 7 times higher chance of admission than a white with similar grades. What happens is, if it was a thumb on the scale, maybe the students would keep up. They don't. They fall massively behind. And so what we've had in the last year, one of the threshold tests in the course of a medical student's education is something called the Step 1 exam for the medical licensing exam. This is a test that's taken after the second year of medical school to test a student's clinical knowledge of various scientific concepts. And because it persisted in showing large racial disparities in who was doing well on the step one licensing exam, the board that issues it decides, okay, we're going to get rid of grades and we're just going to offer it pass fail so that residencies can no longer rank the students in medical schools to decide who to admit. So we are involved in one cover up of the academic skills gap after another. And I can assure you that it is going to continue throughout a medical career. There's pressure to get rid of grades. There's pressure to pass less qualified graduates into residencies, onto college faculties. The preferences never end.
I remember when we were pretty much assured that this stuff wouldn't come for the hard sciences. And now it's
Right.
here. And you see it in public policy as well. I'm even surprised at how rapidly it shifted into actually becoming policy. So with New York, you had racial preferences for priority in terms of getting the monoclonal antibodies during COVID, which very well may have resulted in some people dying because they were pushed to the back of the line. Also, when you see a lot of this woke politicization of these previously neutral institutions, like I never had any reason to doubt the CDC or science or to think that, they had any agenda other than pursuing the truth. Like, this is something that many of us have only changed our minds about because things have changed in the last few years. And so one of the biggest ones as well was you had these doctors who were siding with government authorities that lockdowns were absolutely necessary, and then children should be vaccinated with no scientific backing whatsoever. And then when the George Floyd protests go off, then they turn around, they say, oh no, actually racism is a more deadly virus than the pandemic itself. And it's like, what the hell has happened? You guys are supposed to be neutral. I didn't even know that you guys had not only political biases, but extreme fringe political ideology infecting our medical institutions that would have been inconceivable like 10 years ago. And so it just basically makes people distrustful of the few institutions that we had remaining, which were universally trusted, like our science community. And I'll just give you one more anecdote. My girlfriend's a neuroscientist, and she works at a prestigious university. And on the grant applications for research, you have to explain, if given the grants, how you would be promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the science comes secondarily to that. If you have a great DI statement, then you're going to be the one who gets passed through. But if you don't, then tough luck. What is the answer? Do we just try to create new institutions and then hope that it then forces, kind of like what Elon Musk did with Twitter, and then hoping that the competition is going to have to be a little bit more honest at this point? Because this it seems like such institutional rot that's very hard to change.
Absolutely. I just despair on a daily basis. It is impossible to convey how widespread this is. Just to recap what you've said before I get to the difficult, most difficult question, which is what is to be done. What we've got is white culling. There is a concerted effort to destroy our, it's not that they're trying to destroy our science, but they are engaged in completely trivial, reckless policies where American science is deliberately sabotaging itself. You have many faculties now and that will not even consider somebody's scientific qualifications if their diversity statement is inadequate. They'll toss the applicant. I've raised the question, would Albert Einstein get hired today? I don't think he would, because he would not be able to show how his work on physics advanced diversity. You're not allowed to be a pure scientist anymore. And this is coming out of the National Institutes of Health. They have program after program whose main goal is to make sure that there is a proportional representation of minorities in neurology labs, in Alzheimer's labs, in drug testing, populations, in cancer labs. And I've had scientist after scientist say, I am spending much more time worrying about how to present the issue of my research on signaling in nematodes as a diversity issue of how it helps the Black community in South Philadelphia than I am actually doing the research. So
Right.
we are sabotaging our scientific capacity. Meanwhile, here's what China is doing. Now, China obviously has its extreme pathologies as well, as we saw with its zero COVID insanity. But when it comes to STEM and science, it is about one thing and one thing only: cultivating its top talent. It is not destroying gifted and talented programs as we are doing across the country. Why? For the usual disparate impact reason. The reason we're tearing down gifted and talented is because if you use an objective, colorblind, valid measure of admission, you're not going to have proportional representation. Those tests have a disparate impact on Blacks. China is instead finding its top math talent and throwing everything it's got at them to make sure that they live up to their highest potential. We're destroying our scientific potential. We are saying, if you're white or Asian, we don't want you. We're sending a message to white and Asian students very early on, especially males, that you're an afterthought. And this is not a way to make sure that we stay scientifically competitive. As far as what we do, creating new institutions, it's such a hard task because these legacy institutions have enormous prestige. The stupid alumni keep funneling their kids into them. They keep funneling billions of dollars into these colleges that have by now long since betrayed their fundamental mission of passing on knowledge, because the parents are so hungry to get their kids credentialed with this prestigious degree. If we could find billionaires that were willing to do real risk capital and say, okay, I'm going to try and create an alternative institution. I'm going to try and make it as meritocratic as possible. I'm going to sell it on those grounds that, okay, it's not a Harvard degree, but this is so difficult to get into that you can brag about your child at your cocktail parties that, you know, this degree will be just as prestigious on IQ grounds as going to Cornell or Williams. But at the very least, what we have to do is tell the truth and not be cowed. And we have to keep on saying the alternative explanation. The reason we don't have racial proportionality is not racism, it's the skills gap. As long as the only allowable explanation is racism, which is the status quo today, the left wins. Every institution is coming down.
Yeah, I mean, and it's quite the indictment to say that even the communists aren't doing this, right? I mean, and I've joked about this before. It's even the CRT style intersectional stuff, which some people refer to as cultural Marxism. It is even more sick in a lot of ways than communism, which is pretty insane because communism, it's like the worst thing ever. And even if you go back to like the Soviet Union, as long as you played the party line, you know, you may have been able to get by as a scientist just focusing on science, as long as you didn't, you know, piss off one of your authoritarians. And again, communism, no one's a bigger hater of it than me, but like this is a even more divisive, even more tribalistic ideology than that. And also interesting that like the term diversity itself is so subjectively applied, right? So I remember when I was in university, I was probably the only non-leftist on my student body council, right? And, you know, I could be just derided as just like a white guy or something from somebody who's, you know, I'm half Middle Eastern, I speak Farsi, my mother's a refugee from Iran, my grandfather is from India, my great-grandfather is from Iraq, right? But so I'm not diverse. You know, Larry Elder is the black face of white supremacy. But then you could have a panel of 8 people, all of them being black and female, with the same exact or similar viewpoints, and that's somehow diverse. Of course, Jews aren't diverse anymore. They're not counted for any of the minority points, as are Asians, who have it even worse. Let's talk a little bit about your column about white being a epithet. What do you mean by that?
Well, all that the New York Times or the Washington Post needs to do to discredit an institution or an individual is to append the adjective white before mentioning that institution or individual. And the press or politicians have immediately then have said that this is somebody who is the beneficiary of unjustified privilege, who's participating in a system of ongoing racism. And the consequences are, with that attitude, we are tearing down every institution. All these college harpies, these just depressingly ignorant students that know nothing about contemporary affairs in the world today, about the genocide, the homophobia, the misogyny, the oppression of females, of the other, of disfavored tribes, the killings that are going on that focus exclusively on phantom oppression in the West. All they need to do is say to a teacher is white and therefore oppressive, or classical music, which is a tradition that came out of Europe, Europe was a demographically, the reality was it was Caucasian.
Right.
There's nothing shameful about that. China was monolithically Chinese. Africa was monolithically Black African. These are real distinctions. Only the West destroys itself because of its demographic past and, to a certain extent, its present. And the people that should be passing on these institutions of extraordinary beauty and sublimity, accomplishment, greatness, wit, irony, have instead decided that their authority and power resides in virtue signaling and declaring that, well, this art museums are inherently racist because they're Western. Again, classical music is inherently racist because it's Western. Dance, you name it, and certainly science, certainly the tradition of Anglo-American jurisprudence is suspect. I predict that at some point we're going to have to rename the White House because that's going to be seen as a microaggression, if not a macroaggression, against people of color. I use that term in scare quotes in this country. And so this crusade is being carried on with extraordinary ignorance. I am absolutely willing to say that the 1619 Project is more right than wrong when it comes to the history of white supremacy in this country. I think the conservative narrative about race is, to a certain extent, a whitewash. I think it leapfrogs too quickly to the Civil War and notices that we lost 500,000 Americans to end slavery. Then it leapfrogs to the civil rights era, and it passes over too quickly the appalling nastiness, gratuitous callousness, meanness, mean-spiritedness on the part of the vast majority of white Americans towards blacks until very recently. I'm going to grant the 1619 Project that. I'm not going to grant them their actual history about the founding of the United States, but I think that there is something to be said about noticing the fact that Americans were cruel to blacks for a very long time. That having been said, it is not the case today. It simply is not. We have reversed things. Now the reality is black privilege, not white privilege. And we are going around pretending that we remain that ugly, ugly country of the past, when in fact we have done a remarkable volte-face, a 180-degree change. And we're not willing to recognize that. And in so doing, we are tearing down the ideals, the principles that the left is fighting about. Every concept the left uses to bash the West is a Western concept. Equality, tolerance, due process, equal rights, these are uniquely Western concepts. We have nothing to apologize for when it comes to the great scope of what Western civilization has contributed, because slavery, oppression is going on right now. I will be willing to pay reparations or to start issuing apologies when I hear from Nigeria an apology for the eager, greedy participation in the transatlantic slave trade on the part of Nigerian tribes in Dahomey and elsewhere. When I hear current apologies for mass genocide, they're not coming out, and so therefore I refuse to apologize at this point.
Right. Or the Arab Barbary slave trade, which lasted much longer. Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning, I read from Credit Suisse, there's over 1 million Black American millionaires with $1 million worth of assets. So this is not the same country anymore. And by the way, their children would benefit from affirmative action as well, right? So it's
Right.
over some like poor Filipino kid who like has to work 2 jobs and live in a 1-bedroom apartment with like 3 of his siblings. That's kind of another thing that's just ridiculous about it. That would have more sympathy if it was just based on, income level and actual hardships. Something that worries me a lot is when you constantly, and it's all over the place, the incessant epithets, the incessant insults, whiteness is a disease, whiteness is killing us, whiteness is genocide. What's going to happen when enough people who are white or white Christian basically say, you know what, yeah, we're going to pursue white politics, we're going to have white interest groups, we're going to have, a national association for white people. And it won't be some sort of fringe group, but it'll be millions of people will join. And as somebody as Jewish, that's not something I want. Like, I do not want that at all. There's a lot of overlap between hating Jews and those sorts of politics. But I almost feel like they want that to happen so that they have, as Hillary Clinton would say, deplorable, irredeemable enemy that they can juxtapose themselves next to. Like, you're going to join us, you can join, these neo-Nazis over here, right? And that's one thing I wish that sensible people on the left would at least be a lot more sympathetic to. Is like, why wouldn't it happen when you keep cascading not only white adults but white children and telling them they're oppressors at like 5 years old? Do you think that's something they don't understand, or do you think that's something that maybe they want to happen?
Interesting. I've certainly have written. I think it's inevitable. Well, I take that back. I don't know if it's inevitable because, at least among sort of anybody who is vaguely in the elite, it will not happen.
Right.
The self-loathing at this point is too great. So whether it happens among the less elite people, I don't know, but every effort is going to be made to, I think, contrary. What I've thought in the past is that it's not going to be encouraged by the left. But what I would say, it's completely logical and understandable. There is nothing logically that would prevent whites wanting to complete the circle. If everybody else gets identity politics, why shouldn't we? And it's a question of how much the less elites are aware of the hatred being directed against them. They're not reading the New York Times or listening to CNN. So it may be that this is something that isn't quite on their radar screen at this point, although certainly Tucker Carlson, one of his themes is they hate you. And occasionally he gives it a slight racial inflection. And when he does, other conservative pundits get very upset. People like, people at Commentary or National Review or Ben Shapiro will say, no, we don't want to go there. I have to say, a part of me says, bring it on, because it's a question of just fighting back at this point. So I don't know. It would be completely justified in my view. How much longer can whites be blamed for problems which at this point are not of their own making? Again, I acknowledge the history in this country, but that is not the history today. The reason we don't have proportional representation is that inner city culture for decades now has been oppositional. It's been pathological. Here's a thought experiment. I would be willing to reach for the systemic racism explanation to explain ongoing racial disparities in representation under these conditions. If Blacks acted like Asians for, say, 10, 20, 30 years in all things related to life and academic success, if they studied, if they took their textbooks home, if there was a culture of academic achievement, if parents monitored their kids' homework, made sure they showed up on test days, were not truant, didn't get involved in drugs and gangs, as opposed to what you see now in the inner city. And, if you can get an inner city teacher to talk honestly to you about what those classrooms are like, they're hellholes. They're chaotic. The kids don't take their textbooks home.
Yeah.
Truancy rates in California are 4 times higher.
And the left-wing
Blacks
teacher
than-
unions want to do nothing to basically improve academic performance either. They're against all solutions to improve it.
Well, yeah, I at this point, I also feel like that's a conservative safe harbor. The real change has to come from within that community. Anyway, if blacks acted like Asians in all things related to academic success, and we still saw those racial disparities,
Hmm.
they weren't getting involved in crime, they weren't, getting felony convictions because they're committing drive-by shootings, then I would say, yeah, there's something wrong here. But right now, the behavioral gaps are so huge and so patently the explanation for these ongoing skills gaps that it's just
Yeah.
way
Hmm.
premature to say we're going to invoke this phlogiston of systemic racism.
I will, and maybe the splitting hairs here, but the one thing I'd slightly disagree with is the biggest privilege you can have is having great parents. That trumps everything else. People who are going to
Right.
be
That's right.
looking over your shoulder the whole time, making sure you're out of trouble, making sure you're doing what you need to do, making sure you work hard, make sure you have the right values to succeed. If you
Yep.
don't have that, it's gonna be really tough no matter what your race. However, for some people, if they have strong role models somewhere else, and this is where I'm getting at with a couple of these institutions, they made a movie about, Waiting for Superman with, what's his name, Mr. Canada, Jeffrey Canada, where you have these sort of like, disciplinarian teachers, well-run institutions, they can sort of make up for
Right.
some of that. And for some individuals, they can make up for
Yep.
all of it, right? By taking them under their wing and having really strict standards. Still, ideally, you want great parents. And here's a list of ethnic groups that do better than white American families. It's Indian Americans, Filipino Americans, Taiwanese Americans, Iranian Americans, Israeli Americans, Lebanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Pakistani Americans, and Japanese Americans. Nigerian Americans have almost the same wealth as your average, same income levels as your average white family. And so there's obviously, I mean, like, so you're some sort of middle income or less than middle income white family struggling to get by. You see these stats of other immigrant groups doing really well, and then you're still being blamed for all the problems, and that's a
Right.
recipe for real resentment, and it's not something that we want to see happen. What are you most worried about going forward? Is it continuation of some of these trends, other stuff? And what is something that you're most hopeful about?
Well, I sometimes wonder, what's the audience that we don't know about? How large is the audience for some of these young male conservative commentators? The Ben Shapiro's or Jordan Peterson. He's not so young. Matt Walsh. Is there a group there that can be organized to say we're not taking this group calumny any longer?
Mhm.
And are those thought leaders willing to organize? But if you read comments on newspaper websites in the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times, you do hear some people pushing back. Now, many of the comments can be just even worse than reporting itself,
Mhm.
so self-righteous. But you do realize there are people, as you say, that are noticing what's going on. So if we could figure out a way to marshal those people, and the question is, can it be done by continuing to take the high road, which is what conservatives have done? By and large, they are refusing to use the W word.
Mhm.
There's very few people that are willing to say, wait a minute, white people don't deserve this group guilt. That they're not the problem today. The problems lie elsewhere. And let me just add, I totally agree with you about the so-called no excuses charter schools. What needs to happen is these kids growing up in these completely dysfunctional communities
Mhm.
where there is no social capital being transferred from one generation to the next. Yes, you should be able to surround them with rules in order to create the ability to defer gratification, to exercise self-control. Depressingly, though, as you probably know, one of the progenitors of these total bourgeois value enwrapping institutions, the acronym KIP, I don't remember how it spells out, it's knowledge and power something, they've reversed. They've completely thrown in the towel. They used to have a motto that was all about self-control, personal achievement, trying hard, be nice. And now they've said that's white supremacy. So
Wow.
they no longer even are willing to embrace those bourgeois values. But so that would help. But whether we can fight back without using racial terms, I don't really know. What worries me, I'm perhaps less worried that there's going to be some pogrom on the part of whites. I don't think so. I think Republican, the average Trump voter may be deluded about many things with regards to the election. But my sense is that Americans are so yearning to be post-racial. They really don't give a damn about skin color. What they care about, do your values match mine? White Republicans have had one love affair after another with Black politicians, whether and leading figures, whether it's Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice or Alan Keyes, Alan West, Ben Carson, Herschel Walker to a certain extent, you name it. The woman down in the lieutenant governor in Virginia, what they care about is, do you share the same values of hard work, patriotism, belief in personal responsibility that I do? So I don't fear the pogrom. What I fear is that if we continue down this path, we are dismantling our scientific competitiveness, and we are dismantling the things of such extraordinary beauty that Western civilization has created: classical music, art museums, and we are stripping children of any ability to experience beauty and sublimity. I think that part of the self-destruction that we see on the part, above all, of girls, but the suicide rates, the drug use, is partly because children have been given no reason to be proud of themselves. They are battered all the time with this guilt trip. So they've been given nothing beautiful. They've been told, all the sexual stuff. They're prematurely exposed to knowledge of sexuality, destroying their innocence. I think we are destroying generations as well.
Yeah. And I will, we like to leave it on the hopeful message here. I will say, with regard to the point about some of these conservative influencers, growing up, I never met a single person who was more conservative than their parents. I do see that from time to time now. I do see my parents are so liberal. They, they just read the New York Times. They won't listen to this shit. So that's very interesting. And I saw even Joe Rogan mention it before, that he has liberal friends who are incensed that their children are listening to Ben Shapiro. You never really saw that the other way around. You never saw people more conservative than their parents. So that might be, the hopeful bit after all. And things come in waves, and maybe the woke hour will come to an end one day as well.
It's a fight to the finish. It really is. I mean, to the extent that there is organizing, they will fight back so hard to discredit this. They'll throw everything they've got. Racism, white. What we have to do is tell the truth. And as far as I'm concerned, it starts with the academic skills gap, because, as I say, Ashton, this is the weapon they've got. Lack of racial proportionality, that is driving everything else. And as long as the only allowable explanation is racism, I repeat myself, I know, the left wins, and it's all coming down.
Heather McDonald, thank you so much for being on. It was a real pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. Where can people find more about you, more about your work? Keep up.
Well, I have a Twitter feed that is run sort of for me to just put out everything I write, or any media appearances. I don't even know what the Twitter handle is. But if you Google me, Heather MacDonald, MacDonald, Twitter, it'll get you there. There's also the Manhattan Institute and City Journal, I think, has some semi-comprehensive list of my articles. But I appreciate you giving me that opportunity for publicity. And of course, there's my books, and I've got one coming out on disparate impact next year. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay, great. And we'll put those in the links as well. Thank you so much for being on again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashton. I pleasure being with you.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.
We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.